Welcome to the Growth and Thriving Podcast, where we celebrate the lives of people who have overcome great adversity and examine the tools and techniques by which we grow and create lives that feel like thriving. I'm your host, Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak, the biker psychologist. And today I want to look at one of those, four technically, of those techniques and tools by which we grow and create lives that are thriving. And so today's episode, we're going to examine four communication techniques to improve any relationship. So these techniques are very self-focused, right? They require you to, they actually fall very cleanly, I think, under the umbrella of emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence has four constructs within it. There's self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. And all of these tools, if you will, they're not complex, they're not complicated, they're simple, but they're challenging, they're difficult, they're not easy to do. And with practice, they get easier, but they do require self-awareness, self-management, social awareness of when or when not to use them. That's probably the easiest part of these. And then relationship management is really the desired outcome from these four tools. So it doesn't matter if it's a relationship with a spouse or a significant other, or with your child or parent, or your supervisor at work, or your subordinate at work. These four techniques, if you use them in earnest, really commit to them, they should really help. And that's the thing, is I hesitate to call them techniques. When we talk about a technique, we very often think of a thing we can do quickly, sort of just do it and it helps. And this is not like that. These are more like four practices, four endeavors. And the better you get at them, the more you will be able to navigate conversations and relationships to the outcomes that you want. Nothing, of course, will do that 100% because some of it falls on the other person or people involved, and we have little to no control over them. But very often, if you practice these four endeavors, it will change the way people respond to you, and you will be able to steer the ship in the direction you want it to go. So let's get into them. Let's talk about these four endeavors. I don't think I'm going to call them techniques anymore. They're not technique-y, right? One of them can seem that way, but when you look at it, it's really more involved than just a simple technique. So the first endeavor is to redefine what we mean by winning an argument, right? Winning a debate, winning a conversation. So the best opportunities to do this are when you're anticipating a conversation. You know that you need to have what might be a difficult conversation or what could turn into an argument with your spouse or partner or significant other. Or if you know that you have a meeting with your supervisor at work that could get tense or difficult, or if you know that you have to have a difficult discussion with a subordinate, then it's easier to prepare in this way. It's a little bit more challenging when you're not anticipating the conversation and you're just talking to somebody and it starts to get heated, in which case, when that happens, you will need much better self-awareness and social awareness. But the first endeavor is to redefine what it means to win. So most of us, when we feel like we're in a debate or we feel like we're in an argument, winning typically means that we outperform the other person, that we outdo them, that our point trumps their point, or that we come up with enough evidence or enough counterpoints that we shut their point down. Excuse me. So for most of us, especially when the disagreement or discussion emerges organically, when we're not anticipating it, right? It's one thing to know that tomorrow at 10 I have a meeting with a subordinate in which I need to correct some behavior or have what could be a difficult. I can anticipate that. It's much more difficult when I'm talking to my partner and we just start to disagree about something and it starts to get impassioned and the temperature starts to get hot. That makes it a little more challenging. But here's the issue. When we start to feel like somebody else is challenging us, undermining us, demeaning us, again, we want to win. We want to come out on top, which means by default they lose. And if we can redefine that in our mind such that winning means that the relationship wins. So if I'm talking to my subordinate at work, winning will mean that my subordinate walks away from the conversation feeling heard, validated, supported by me, and with a clear understanding of what I need him or her to do differently or how I need them to perform, but without animosity, feeling like these needs of mine were communicated clearly in an environment of support where I'm on their team and I'm a resource for them and willing to work to help them be successful. And I walk away from that conversation feeling confident that I have an impassioned subordinate who now clearly understands what the standards are and what's required of him or her. And because he or she feels supported and empowered, I can trust that this person is going to work with vigor to try to accomplish the clear goals and definitions that I set out. In a conversation with my partner, winning means that we end the conversation in a way, at the end of things, we feel closer to each other. We both feel heard and understood, and we feel like our relationship is strong enough to manage differences of opinion or disagreements. And we feel a sense of closeness to one another. And we feel that our relationship has been strengthened instead of weakened by this conflict, potentially. Neither one of us should walk away feeling defeated or beaten by the other. Neither one of us should walk away feeling triumphant over the other, right? We can both walk away feeling triumphant that we did what was in the best interest of our relationship, of our household, of our family. And so we want to enter into these conversations to the best of our ability with the idea of what winning means is not shutting down the other person and trumping their arguments with ours. It's collecting all of the information from the other person and from my mind and from my experience and sorting through what is valid and meaningful on both sides, giving due credit to the opposing view where it makes valid points, and then approaching the collaboration, because a conversation should be a collaboration, in a way that the organization, that the team at work, that the family, that the military unit comes away stronger and functioning better as a result of that conversation. If we can go into the conversation with that goal in mind, with that desired outcome, it changes how we interact. And most importantly, it changes how we listen. Instead of listening to respond and trump, we listen to understand. Even if we disagree. It's okay to disagree. But are we disagreeing with the intent of retorting and being right? Or are we disagreeing because we see something about our approach or their approach that would work better for the family, for the relationship, for the organization. So that's number one. Much, much harder to do than it sounds. It doesn't sound hard at all, but it is very difficult, especially when we get emotional. And that's where that self-awareness and self-control from emotional intelligence, or EQ, becomes very important, because we have to recognize that our emotions are getting high. And if our emotions are getting high, they're going to short circuit what we had planned to do in our thinking brains, in our prefrontal cortex. So that's number one. Number two, and this is the one that can sometimes get techniquey, if you will, is the I statement. So when we are in a conversation with somebody who is not doing what we need them to do, or we're having a disagreement with a partner, or we're receiving difficult feedback from a superior at work, sometimes we can get sort of defensive, and it becomes all about you. You know, you always do this to me, and you don't understand me, and you don't hear me, and you make me feel a certain kind of way. And any statements that start with you are very likely to escalate and not resolve whatever conflict's happening at the moment. So when we start statements with I, what we end up doing is, instead of telling the other person how they are, you know, you are such a jerk and you do this all the time, and you, right? We're telling them how it impacts us. And here's where things get a little challenging, is it's not just about starting the sentence with I. It's about a way of structuring what you say. And the way of structuring is to share how you feel or how you react, taking full ownership that your feelings and reactions are yours. How I feel and how I react when you act or behave in a very specific way. So, you know, if I say to my partner in an argument, you know, you never listen to me, my partner is going to come back and say, yes, I do. I listen to you all the time, you know. And then how do we win? How do we resolve that? How does that end? It just escalates until we get more and more angry. And I get to say, no, you're not even listening to me right now. I just told, right? And we escalate. So when I start with the I statement, I start by saying, you know, I feel unheard. I feel ignored. I feel invisible when I tell you what my thoughts are and you're looking at your phone or you're watching TV. What this is intended to do is, if I tell my partner, first of all, what they always or never do, they're going to disagree and we won't resolve anything. And especially if I tell them how they feel, you know, you don't care about my feelings at all. How do I know that? How do I know that? Right? But when I can highlight the behavior in great detail, highlight the behavior that makes me think that makes me think that they don't care about me at all, and I can share that that's how I feel when they engage in that behavior, well, then my partner can't tell me I don't feel that way, right? And so if I say to my partner, just as an example, this could work with a boss or subordinate too. It could be at work. It doesn't have to be at home. But it is a technique very commonly used by couples therapists in communication. That's why I keep saying partner. I used it a lot when I was a therapist working with couples. And so if my partner if I say to my partner, I feel really unimportant and unheard, ignored, when I'm trying to talk to you and you are checking your email at the same time. And what happens is, I'm not telling my partner how she is or what she does or what, and so it's hard for her to come back and say, no, I don't, yes, I do. And she can't really tell me I don't feel that way, right? She could certainly say, well, you shouldn't feel that way, which is also a communication mistake. You don't tell other people how they should or shouldn't feel. But it gives her the opportunity to come back and say, well, I don't want you to feel ignored or unimportant. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that when I was looking at my emails, it had that effect. Maybe I didn't even realize I was looking at my emails when we were talking. I wasn't paying attention. Please forgive me. Or it gives my partner the opportunity to say, well, too bad. I had some important email stuff going on and I needed to do it. And if you wanted to wait a few minutes to talk, I would have been happy to do that. But it definitely it circumvents this idea of me saying, well, you never listen to me. And my partner saying, sure, I do. And then there's no resolution. But it gets angrier. It escalates. A quick funny story about the I statement and how not to do it is when I was a young therapist just getting trained, I was working during my residency at a university counseling center, at a university that sort of catered to non-traditional students. So there was a lot of older students, a lot of former military students, things like that. And so I had a married couple that I was working with who were both students of the university. And she said to him in my office in the middle, they were arguing, and she said, you know, you're such an asshole. You never listen to me. And I said to her, well, let's try that again. Express the same thing, but start it with I. And she said, I think you're such an asshole. You never listen to me. That's the technique. She did the letter of the law, but she didn't achieve the spirit of the approach, of the guideline. The spirit is not that you just start a sentence with I. The spirit is that you're telling the other person, and this is the formula again, you're telling the person how you feel or how it impacts you, what your reaction is when they behave in a specific sort of way. Now, like I said, there can be lots of responses. The most common response is like, oh, well, I didn't know I made you feel that way, and I can change this behavior. That's what happens a lot. But sometimes the person comes back and says, well, I think your reaction is a little bit disproportionate. I think you're overreacting. I don't understand how what I did led to that reaction. That's a more difficult conversation, but at least it's still productive. And it's not just trying to trump one another. It's still moving in the direction of hearing one another and sorting it out in a way that benefits the relationship. So that's number 2, is the I statement. Approach number 3, or endeavor number 3, toward improving communication and improving relationships as a result, is to use the phrase, the story in my head, or some version of it. What happens very often in difficult situations, right? We write our boss an email that we think is pretty important and requires some sort of immediate response in our mind, and we don't hear back. And then we start to tell ourselves stories, right? We start to tell ourselves, oh man, I made him angry with that email. He's upset with me now. He doesn't want to respond. He doesn't want to talk to me. And we assume that those stories are true, right? Just because we thought it, we think it's real. Or, I buy something for my kid that they need for soccer, and my kid doesn't respond, doesn't say thank you, doesn't get excited. And the story in my head is that they're ungrateful and they just expect me to buy them things, and they don't care that I went out of my way during my busy day to get them something. And so those are the stories in my head. And very often, like I said, when we think those things, we tend to think that they're true. We make those assumptions, but they are absolutely assumptions. I don't care how well you know the other person. Even if there's a 98% chance that your assumption is correct, there's a 2% chance that it is incorrect. And it's going to influence how you approach that person when you see them. Maybe you'll give them the cold shoulder and ignore them, and or you'll get angry and snippy with your children and be sort of passive aggressive, why don't I just buy you everything, right? Whereas if you can own that that's your story and that that's your assumption, you can present it that way in your communication. You can say to your kiddo, assuming they're old enough to get it, right? Really young kids might not get this. But if they're old enough to get it, if they're, 11, 12, adolescent, you can say to your kiddo, I bought you your shin guards for soccer. I had a really busy day yesterday, but I made a point of getting to the sporting goods store and getting you what you needed. And you didn't show any appreciation, right? Here's the behavior. I was expecting you to show some excitement or appreciation, and you didn't. And the story in my head, or my assumption, is that you don't really appreciate how hard it was for me to get over there and spend good money on what you needed when I had a really busy day. And maybe that's true. It gives my kiddo the opportunity to say, Dad, you're right. I did take it for granted, and I'm really sorry. I'll try to be more appreciative, to have more gratitude for the things you do. Now, to be fair, I don't think my kids have ever said that, and I don't know if they ever will. But it gives them that opportunity. It also gives them the opportunity to say, no, Dad, I'm sorry if it didn't seem like I was excited, but, something happened at school and I was kind of upset and preoccupied about it, and so maybe I wasn't paying attention when you gave it to me. I really do appreciate it, and I'm sorry, right? Something like that. If I say to my boss, I sent you this email and it seemed kind of important to me, and I was expecting a prompt response, and when you didn't respond, I made the assumption that it upset you or that you were angry with me in some way. Now, of course, my boss can say, that email was way off base and it really upset me and I didn't respond because I was angry, right? You could say that. And then that's still productive. Because then I can say to my boss, well, can you help me understand what it was that made you angry in the email? I didn't realize there was anything inflammatory or whatever, right? But it also gives my boss the opportunity to say, no, it was just I was in meetings with the board of directors all day, and I was preoccupied, and your email is absolutely important. I will get a response to you. I'm sorry it took so long, right? Whereas if I just avoid my boss because I'm afraid he's mad at me, that productive conversation can't happen. So the self-awareness piece is to recognize that the story in your head is yours. It's your assumption. You need to own it. And don't own it as truth, not until it's verified, right? But even if it is correct, even if the story in your head is correct, telling somebody else, hey, here's my assumption, you're taking ownership of what went on in your mind and in your body. And even if you're correct, it gives the other person the opportunity to say, you know what, you're right. That is what I felt. I was angry with you, or I was upset. And then you can work it out. Whereas if you just act out in anger because you've assumed that they were angry, or you act out defensively, it's unlikely to improve the situation in the near future. I mean, it can improve eventually, but you have to go through some hardship first. So approach number 3 is to first recognize that your explanations, right? When somebody reacts or doesn't react in a particular way, the only data we have is their behavior. That's it. And the explanation behind their behavior is the story in our head. If you really want to take this to a next level, be a scientist. Scientists are trained when they observe something or see a problem they want to solve to entertain multiple hypotheses. So your first initial hypothesis about a thing could say, oh, I think they reacted this way because of X. But a good scientist will recognize right away that that is hypothesis 1. Let's come up with 2 or 3 others. What other explanations could there be? All right? The sort of cliched example for this is the person who cuts you off in traffic, and our immediate story in our head is that person's such an asshole. What a jerk. They're driving like a lunatic, right? That's hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2 could be that, they have their pregnant wife in the car and they're racing to the hospital. They still cut you off, that's true, but maybe we're more willing to forgive in that instance, right? So that's hypothesis number 2. There's probably others. You could probably come up with 1 or 2 more hypotheses of why that person, maybe that person was trying to get to their exit and in their haste, they didn't notice you there. Well, that's still poor driving on their part, but it's maybe a little less personal than them intentionally cutting you off, right? So that helps us de-escalate our emotional response. It helps us communicate and take ownership of what we're thinking, right? We're not dismissing what we think. We're not ignoring what we think or invalidating it. We're sharing it with the other person, but we're owning it as the story in our head, not as the truth. And so that's technique number 3, or approach number 3, is to recognize that the story in your head or the explanation you came up with is not necessarily fact. Last but not least, the final approach, number 4, and let me, since I said the final approach, let me be very clear that these are not the four approaches to improve communication. There's a billion ways to improve communication. And becoming an effective communicator is a lifelong endeavor, because each time you make progress, you will encounter somebody new with whom you don't communicate well right away, and you will have to learn how to communicate with that person, and that will improve your skill set a little more, and then you'll encounter another person and you'll have to, right? And people who do public speaking or sales or things where they're interacting with a lot of people tend to be pretty good communicators, because they get not only good at the self-awareness and self-management piece of communication, but they get really good at the social awareness and recognizing the other person's reactions and cues and working off of those. So these are 4 approaches that will absolutely improve any communication, any relationship you have if you practice them. But they're not the only 4, right? And it would be a mistake to say it that way. So the last one for this podcast episode, the last one I'm going to talk about today, is do not trust your own perceptions and your own memory. They are so much more fallible than you think. I can't tell you how many arguments as a younger person I had with girlfriends or people I knew at the time when I would say, oh, you did or said X, Y, or Z, and they would say, no, I didn't. And I'd say, I remember it clearly, and right? And the truth is that sometimes your memory's right, sometimes it's true, but very often it is flawed. There's so much research demonstrating that our memories can be impacted by all sorts of things. We know that some adults have absolute memories. They will swear up and down that they remember a thing from their childhood, clear as day, going to Disneyland, when in fact they never went to Disneyland. But maybe their cousins went or their parents went or something, and they've heard the story so many times that they created a memory, and they will swear under oath that they were there. They weren't. It's very well known that eyewitnesses in court cases are notoriously inaccurate, and attorneys will use that to sway the evidence in their favor. So, the classic example is an attorney, maybe in a case, like a civil case maybe, or even a criminal case, doesn't matter, dealing with a car accident or a moving violation, and they'll have the magnet board that has the intersection on it with the buildings, and they'll show you where the cars were positioned and where the driver A was and where the defendant was and where and they will ask the witness, and so on this map, where did you say the green sedan was? And the witness will answer them. The green sedan was, on Main Street, just south of the intersection. And the fact of the matter is, there was no green sedan. The attorney implanted the memory into the other person's mind just by the power of suggestion. But if you talk to the other person, they will legitimately believe that they saw the green sedan. And the funny part is, if you ask them before they walked into the court, hey, tell me what happened, of course they never saw a green sedan, so they would tell you what happened and there would be no green sedan. But once the attorney says, hey, can you tell me where on here the green sedan was? not 100%, but a good number of people. I mean, I'm sure there's some number of people that would say there was no green sedan, but a number of people, a percentage of people that is greater than chance, so statistically significant number of people, will tell you where the green sedan was, even though it wasn't there. Same thing, we have a similar problem with how we perceive things and our perceptions. Our perceptions are filtered through our life experiences. They're filtered through our culture, through our sex or gender, through our religion, through our nationality, through our lens of experiences, right? This becomes very clear when you compare people from very different cultures. People from one culture might say that a person who is hearing voices that nobody else hears has schizophrenia and is hallucinating. Whereas somebody from another culture might say that they are connecting with a spirit world. The perceptions of what's happening are very different, and the assumptions around those perceptions are very different. And so if your goal, if we go back to number one of these four, if your goal in an interaction of some sort is to make sure that the relationship or the organization wins, comes out on top, then it is a mistake to vehemently defend your memory or your perceptions. Now, that doesn't mean you should discount them or discredit them either. But it is perfectly okay to say, well, I don't remember it that way at all. Here's what I remember happening. Now, I understand that my memory might be flawed, but maybe you could also entertain the possibility that your memories, maybe both of our memories are wrong. But we need to find a way to move on from here, because the way you recall it and the way I recall it are very different. Right? The way you perceive that and the way I perceive that are very different. And so, okay, we can agree that you saw it this way and I saw it that way, and who knows? Maybe what actually happened was a third variable and we're both wrong. But let's move on from here, and then the conversation becomes productive. Right? Or maybe we can take pieces of what I remember. We can look at where what I remember and what you remember overlap, and then try to figure out what to do with the areas where they digress. Right? If this is hard for you because you're like, well, no, I know what I remember. Right? Let's start with the fact that our perceptions are imperfect. They just are, right? And I know for sure that you have, at some point in your life, seen things, experienced things, went to events with a friend, with a partner, and then talked to them about it, and their perception of it was entirely different from yours. And you're left with this idea of like, did we even go to the same event? And yet it happens because they perceive it, they filter it through a bunch of different filters than you did, and they come up with a different end result. So let's start with the fact that our memories are created from these imperfect perceptions. So right off the bat, right off the bat, they're imperfect. Now, here's the interesting thing about memory. First of all, it's completely flawed because it's a recreation. So if I, went to a sporting event last night and I'm remembering it, my mind is recreating it, right? It's not like the actual thing is stored like on a hard drive and I'm just pulling out the data. My mind is recreating what I think happened. That recreation is, in all likelihood, going to be slightly imperfect, especially because if I was at a soccer match or a football game, I was probably watching right where the ball was, and I probably didn't pay much attention to what people on the other side of the field were doing or who was open downfield. It's very unlikely that I saw everything. This is why at a lot of those games they have multiple referees on the field, right? And so I'm recreating the memory from what I paid attention to, from what I attended to, not from what actually happened. So that's my first recreation. Now, if I remember it today and I tell you about it, and then later, next week sometime, we're at a restaurant and you have a friend with you and you say, hey, tell Joe here about the game you went to last week, and I remember it again. I am no longer recreating the original event. I am now recreating the memory from last time. Each time I remember the thing, I am recreating not the original thing, but the last memory of it. And so if even the first memory was imperfect because it was based on what I was attending to, and I certainly didn't catch all of it, and maybe my memory, remember the green sedan, maybe I implanted a green sedan where there wasn't one, and yet I remember it being there, each subsequent memory is also going to be imperfect. And so it's like if you try to, on a photocopy machine, make a copy of a copy of a copy, the first one or two or three are going to look pretty good. But once you get down to 20, 30, 40 copies, you're going to notice massive imperfections in those copies. And your memory is like that as well. And so if you are in a conversation or a disagreement or an argument, no matter how strongly you are convinced that you remember a thing a certain way, if the goal is for the relationship to win or the organization to win, to come out on top, and not for you to beat the other person, then we can certainly assert that, man, I feel strongly about this memory, but I recognize that it could be incorrect. And that tiny little bit of wiggle room is sometimes all you need to work collaboratively with the other person or the other people to have a successful communication instead of a major blow up which breaks down into no progress at all. So, to review, the 4 techniques or practices that I recommend people work on to improve communication in virtually any relationship. And again, these are not the only 4. These are just 4 that are frequently trained and taught by coaches and generally produce good results across the board regardless of environment or specifics. The first is to redefine what it means to win an argument or a dispute or a discussion. And try to get to a space in your mind where it is no longer about defeating the other person across the table or on the couch with you, but it is about getting to a point where the relationship wins, where the two of you can walk away feeling closer, having a greater sense of trust, understanding each other better, and working in the best interest of whatever the organization is, whether it's an office situation or a social situation or a romantic situation. That's number 1. Redefine what it means to win. That will help you with all the other 3 approaches. It will help you because the interest is at a different outcome. The desired outcome is not to stomp the other person. It's to improve the situation. Number 2, use your I statements. But just starting a sentence with I is not enough. You have to describe how you are impacted, how you feel, how you perceive a situation when the other person acts in a very specific way. What is the exact behavior that the other person does, and what is your reaction to it? Now, their behavior does not cause your reaction. That's not true. Their behavior is what it is, and your reaction is what it is, and you may have a good reason for your reaction, and that's okay. But if you own your share and help them understand what's their share, then everybody can work with their own part, right? I can work on my reaction. You can work on your behavior, especially if you are invested in not upsetting me, right? If I'm a friend or a partner and you don't want us to argue or be upset and you know a behavior upsets me, maybe you can adjust that behavior, but I can also work on understanding that you're not trying to upset me, and so I can manage my reactions a little better. So that's number 2, is the I statements. Number 3, the story in my head, right? I make an assumption that you're mad at me or that you didn't like what I did or said or that you forgot my birthday or whatever it is. Until that's verified, I don't know that it's true. And for me to behave as though it's true is a little bit of hubris. So the best thing, I don't like to tell people what they should do, but probably the best thing to do is to share with you what my assumptions are. Here's the story in my head. This thing happened, and I'm telling myself that this is what's going on between us. Maybe I'm right, and if I'm right, then great, we can work on it. And if I'm wrong, then that helps me with number 4, right? Because number 4 is don't trust my perceptions and my memory all the time. Sometimes they're accurate, and they have degrees of accuracy. That's fine. But not always. They're very fallible, right? And so if I have a willingness to accept that no matter how strongly I really remember this clearly, that memory could have A, been built on a faulty perception, and B, could have been distorted over time, which happens even to people with the healthiest memories. It happens to everyone. No one is immune from it. And if you don't believe me, go search the research. Go on Google Scholar and look on memory research. Memories are terrible generally. Even people with great memories are very fallible. So the willingness, and that doesn't mean that you just give up and say, oh, well, I guess my memories are wrong. Or no, but having a willingness to understand, to say, boy, I very clearly remember X, Y, and Z. But, maybe my memory's incorrect. Maybe that's not quite the way it was. It changes the intensity and the heat of the conversation. It has the impact of allowing the other person or people involved to see that you're not just trying to dig your heels in the dirt, but that you are willing to work with them and to concede a point if even though it's hard to understand that maybe you remember something incorrectly, but it also does something internally, right? The more you dig your heels and say, no, I remember it, and the more they say, no, it wasn't that way, the angrier you're going to get. But the minute you concede and say, well, I do very clearly remember it this way, but I could be wrong, it de-escalates your insides, right? It cools your jets so that you can proceed in the conversation in a way that is a little more constructive. So what I recommend you do is try these out, work on them for a while, think about them, come away from some conversations and ask yourself, did I do these 4 things? Where could I do them better? And as you start to work with them, please hit me up, message me either on YouTube, on the channel if you're watching this podcast episode, or you can go onto the Facebook communities. You could go into Growth and Thriving After Hardship and Adversity, or Leadership for Badass Survivors, or Parenting After Adversity, any of those Facebook communities, and leave a comment. Let me know how it worked out for you. Let me know how you're doing with these 4 techniques or approaches. I'd love to hear from you. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. I'm so appreciative of your time. It's your most valuable asset, and I am very blessed and privileged that you choose to spend it with me when I deliver this content. If you like this content, please like it, comment, and share it. Share it with your networks. I appreciate you so much. Thank you so much. And I wish you all the very best. And until the next time, this is Dr. Jerry Sunshine Novak, the biker psychologist, saying, just keep growing until you're thriving. Take care, y'all.